welcome. I am Martha McPhee, and I am a professor of creative writing in the English department, and I also curate the Great Writers, Great Reading series. And an offshoot of that, which I started several years ago, is called another series called Celebrating Our Own, which brings students back to campus, former students who've gone on to publish. It is it's a singular joy of a professor to see the promising young student flourish and publish such great work. And tonight we're celebrating Elizabeth Schmermund, who has a book of poetry out right now. It's for sale in the back, and students get a discount. I highly recommend everybody buy a copy. So it's just a pleasure to be able to welcome you back. I remember Elizabeth from our long ago classes together. I actually couldn't remember how long ago. I was shocked when I looked up old emails and saw 2007, and that was like when my emails started. So it even predates that. I think we figured out around 2005, which is, oh my goodness, I was 3 years here. I never thought I'd be here this long, but I'm so happily here. But her work stood out to me immediately. She was the kind of student who understands intuitively the power of language and how to use it. An early story of hers that still has a hold on my memory and imagination was set in Hawaii. Elizabeth could evoke the landscape with precise detail, creating both character and mood through the use of setting to orient and place the reader firmly there. The other thing I remember about that story was it was a romance of some. There was a romantic thing going on, and she was so young, and it was so wise. I wondered, how did she have this experience? How could she articulate this? But she did. A few years ago, she sent me her essay. It's probably a long time ago now, but it feels like just a few years ago. A Cottage by the Beach. I read it immediately and was moved beyond measure, crying at my computer, feeling her loss, the loss of a new baby. The ache was palpable. She rendered it this way by being achingly honest while not asking for pity. As I said, she understands intuitively the power of language and how to use it to generously share with her readers what is in her heart. Today, she will read from her book of poetry, also about this loss. It's called Alexander the Great, right? I love the title. After she reads, we will talk and a little bit, and then she'll take some questions from you guys. So please help me welcome Elizabeth Schmermund back to Hofstra.
Thank you so much, Martha. It's been almost 20 years. Yikes, it feels weird to say that, right? But I can't express enough what an impact my time here and the professors that I had here, especially Martha, made on my life trajectory. And it's such a special place here, and it feels so good to be back. I'm so appreciative to be back. So as Martha said, this chapbook that I wrote, Alexander the Great, was written in the aftermath of my newborn son's death in 2017. And I think, so in the immediate aftermath, it was very unexpected. And I was kind of left totally adrift, totally disoriented in what seemed like a new and fragmented reality, and myself as a new and fragmented person. And so it took me a while, I think, it took me several weeks to be able to even concentrate on words on a page. And then when I did, all I wanted to read was about grief. That's all I wanted. I read so many great books. A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis. I I read a lot of wonderful poetry by Mary Oliver, who's one of my favorites, Sharon Olds, who writes beautifully about miscarriage, loss in such simplistic, simple language, but in about such powerful and complex experiences. And that was really my conduit to living again, right? To feeling like a connection with the world again, and a connection with other people who lived through really horrible things and were able to create something from it, some kind of art to be able to connect with others. And so I started writing, and I started writing poetry, and I had always written a lot of short stories and essays, and I certainly do have, I think, a few novels in like a drawer somewhere that didn't really see the light of day. But, I sought out poetry because that was the way to capture these bursts of emotion and these maybe even the fragmented reality of my life that it felt like. And so I wrote these poems over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, and I put them away. And as I went through this journey of grief, I didn't need them in the same way anymore. I was still writing, but I was also writing other things. And then one day I came back to them, and I realized that I had quite a lot of poems and that they could be a manuscript, at least a chapbook, 20 poems or something around there. And I put them together, and it became Alexander the Great, this chapbook. And what I was really interested in doing was not forcing a narrative or any kind of linear structure of improvement or progress or end to it. I really wanted to avoid that, instinct to make, to wrap it up in a neat ending. And so I tried to do that with these poems, and when the way that I decided to compile the book together. So, all right, so I'll read some of them. The first poem in the collection is titled Alexander the Great, and it's the title poem. It's in 2 parts. I know Alexander the Great conquered after he watched his father's blood fill a stadium of spectacle, a theater upon which his short life would propel him outward, eastward. A strategic move, but perhaps more untethered than questing. Young and willful, but also with no home to return to and certainly no comfort awaiting his return from the horizon. In that long east, there was no future but to die young, idolatrized and proceeded to the banks of that dark river by Hephaestion, whose body lay supine and denied burial, while Alexander clung to him. My Alexander taught me, it is the giving away that is the hardest. It is watching the purple rising and then settling in the once fat cheeks. It is the hardness entering the body. It is this battle no one can win. Part 2. Before you were born into death, Alexander seemed like a warlike name, and I worried about what violence would accompany your great entrance into the world. These were during the days when the future was unconquered, when it was a reflected thing, wavering as a straight road ahead, but not invisible. I could accept your conquering ways, evidenced by the sharp heel in my side, if I would be your companion and your journey would not forget she who bore you, like fat overripe grapes on the vine. Life was awaiting the harvest, the next city to fall. These seconds that were conquered and bent to my will. But Alexander would never return to Macedon, not even to the northern shore of Egypt, the lip of the Nile. You too would not return home, but would transform a city, a home, into a light on the hill. It is grief that cannot be hid, even as your persistence is measured by a flickering light in the window. Many passers-by don't deign to see it, but I keep it lit, and it warms me. So we might have a chance to talk a little bit more about that after. But one of the things that I was thinking about a lot when I wrote that poem was this idea of legacy and of history, and how do you grieve a child that didn't get a chance to make their mark on the world. And in the beginning, I had this compulsion, and sometimes I still do, although it's amazing how grief transforms in these years, right? To write his name in everything, everywhere, so that he left a mark, right? And so I think that's what I was kind of grappling with that poem a little bit. This next poem, We Called Him, is a particularly difficult one for me. It's about my son, and telling my son, who's here, and who this work is also dedicated to. And telling him about the loss of his baby brother. We called him. We called him into the hospital room. I slid from the bed to a chair to appear as his mother always did. A shaft of light burned around us. A social worker sat nearby. And slowly we spoke in unison, without opacity, as they say. Your brother died. He blinked twice. We choked back animal sobs. My baby is gone, he asked. He was 4. We imagined 4 years between them, and now the years spread out distorted, the math all wrong. One child would always be left ageless, while the other would grow beyond our reach. He didn't speak for a while. He watched cartoons that now remind me of the odor of death. Then he pointed at my still swollen stomach. Is my baby still there, he asked. And I wondered when my son would ever again have a mother who could answer the simplest questions clear-eyed, as if any answers now existed. Where did his mother go? I knew she had packed up and a stealthy substitute remained, but I didn't want him to know the magnitude of his loss. We emerged into a new world from those neon lights. One day we passed a graveyard. He called the stones gravels. My baby is just bones now, he said, as the substitute wept behind the wheel. It's kind of amazing how, I guess you learn as you're living with grief and as you're trying to transform some of the grief into art that, joy and humor can also exist with it, right? At the same time. He really did call gravestones gravels for a long time. Okay. I'll read maybe 2 more poems. This is I lie when I say I feel you. I lie when I say I feel you, like a deceptive prophetess. I feed the masses in my house these crumbs of faith, goldfish-like flakes of a story that death has no dominion. I did feel you once. I felt your heel dig into my deepest side, hell-bent and pressing, an urgent cry without the deliverance of breath. And since then, my son, you have provided no salve. I tell my living child, he is your brother. You must love him. You must remember the unmemorable, the unknowable. And I pad my insistence with chocolate cake. I urge the phone to ring on your death day. I focus on the lightness of your ashes and not the crumbled bone itself. But I let my anger steep like boiling tea. I urge it to awaken within myself, fanned by the space left by you, my newborn, my new death, my ever son, my ever loss. The contradiction feeds me, and I devour it until no mass remains. These sad rumblings will tear me apart. We protect that which emerges from us, our dominion, And yet you, unknowable thing, son, you have outreached my grasp. And I, on your second death day, pretend you have not flown far. Who is the motherless child and whose child has fled? You have not listened these years. I command you to come back to me. All right, I'll read one more. And this poem was originally written as it's almost an epistolary poem, like a poem written almost as a letter to someone, although I don't think it's necessarily evident. A letter. Your life as a mother awaits you as it awaits all mothers. The first night you realize her body is no longer within yours, cocooned and safe, the snip resolving of a tongue tie. A first night down the hall, wailing away from your own bed. I felt those pains once. It's easy to feel immune these days. And then the school bus pulls away and my flesh waves goodbye through the fingerprinted glasses. Or I hear the word 4 eyes and my haunches prepare to pounce. I climb up and down a ladder of pain, each level surprising me when I arrive. And sometimes, when I reach the top alone, I disdain those who have safely remained below. It's not a choice or a wish. I remind myself of this each day I summit. It's much more frightening than this. It's a letter destined to remind us that there is no sender. Not only that, there's no paper upon which to imprint our grief, and our hands remain perpetually empty. All right, thank you.
But I didn't. Oh,
sorry.
Well, the power of writing. It's some work. Congratulations, on the book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I think about you mentioned books at the start, books of poetry that were important to you. How did you understand, and also prose, but how did you go to poetry? I never knew you as a poet.
Yeah.
I don't even know if you took classes in poetry here.
I didn't.
Yeah, how did that speak to you?
I was thinking about this. I'm glad you asked that question. I think I was kind of always writing poetry, but I didn't consider myself a poet. I think when I start writing something, poetry usually comes from like a deeply felt emotion or observation, whereas when I am writing like an essay, for example, right, I have like a general, it's more of a developed thought. And I think that that's what the power, I think that that's what the power of poetry is, that it can be, this kind of strike of emotion that you then work with and think through and revise and transform into something more than, because I think poetry should always be more than just the emotion. It becomes something else. It has more weight and more meaning at the end of it. And then the other thing is I remember, I think I read something that Lucille Clifton said when someone said, "Why do you write poetry and why do you write in such short lines?" And she said, "I have 6 children." So it's also just like, it's easy to snatch, 10, 15 minutes, and just like the process of writing poetry and put it away and then come back to it and revise. Whereas I feel writing prose, I think you have to wade into it for maybe longer spurts of time,
Yeah.
Yeah.
How would you say that Sharon Olds, and who was the other poet that you mentioned?
Mary Oliver.
Oh, yeah, Mary. How did they teach you to write poetry? If they did. I mean,
yeah, they did a lot. I think what I love about Sharon Olds is that she doesn't shy away from the body, right? She writes about women's experiences and women's physical experiences. I mean, she was writing about miscarriage and of the loss of a baby in miscarriage in very clear and deceptively simple language with attention to the body of a woman, right? And Mary Oliver, I mean, what can you say about Mary Oliver, right? She takes an observation, she takes descriptive language, and it becomes a whole world. So in Blackwater Woods is one of my favorites of hers, and a meditation on the natural world becomes this larger feeling of communion that just, her poetry always makes me feel like I'm not alone. And I think that sense of communion or connection is such a wonderful way to start writing poetry as well. I don't know if it was in your class that you said this, but something about how when we start out, a really great way to start out writing is through imitation of, right? Does that sound like? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So reading and imitating the works of poets or writers that we really enjoy, understanding what we like about their work, how it works. Imitating in poetry, you can do that because you could say after, this poem is after this particular author, this poet, and then go from there and find your style, and find your own unique voice.
Did you find solace in this? Did you start writing immediately or pretty soon after? Like you said, it took you a few weeks, which seemed soon to me.
Yeah.
So, and then with that, was it hard to go deep? Did you feel vulnerable? You go so deep. It's so penetrating, and you hit the nerve. But what was that? Was that helpful, and what was that experience like?
I think that's a really interesting question because I think it can be really, I think it could be really hard because sometimes it can be triggering, right, or re-triggering to write about these difficult things. I feel like I was just like on this, like this, I don't know what the word for it, but like some kind of PTSD loop or like grief loop where I could not think about anything else. And my whole life was grief, and I felt like I think I used the term like a substitute in one poem, or like a robot, and I remember like walking to class to teach my students and having to put like a face on and being like, yes, I'm dressing in, I think Gabrielle Colva Caresi, who's another wonderful poet who writes about grief, says wearing her skin suit, and like pretending that I'm a functioning human being enough to not be thinking about this all the time and to do something else. And so I think poetry was almost like this compulsive action of what was already going on in my head. And so, but then what's interesting with this question, right, is that I put it away and I didn't look at it for a while. And then when I went back, because you always have to go back and you always have to revise and revise and revise, I think then I was in a different space and a different place in my life, and that was definitely hard. And I was just saying how I was reading, some of these poems yesterday, and I was so surprised to cry, So some of them can be, it's hard to go back into that headspace sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. But also so powerful that you can use art to help you get through something as well. And then give it to people, give it to as a book to your readers to help them as well. So at Hofstra, what did you understand about your future? Did you think that you would live a creative life? Did you?
I really hope so. I think I always wanted to be a writer. I always loved reading. It was always my outlet and my solace and my everything. But I think until I came here, and I think really until I took your class, Martha, I didn't think that it was a possibility for me. I didn't, like you were like a role model of someone who could, a young woman, a writer who was doing all of these things and who would say to me, and this is why, you and my time here have been so influential, and who said to me, you can do it too, There's this one thing I will never forget, sitting in your office, and I said, I love writing, but I have had such a hard time writing lately in the past maybe year or something, but I'm really struggling. And she said, that doesn't mean you're not a writer. You said that doesn't mean you're not a writer. You can be not writing, and you're still a writer. It's the way you look at the world. It's your observation of the world. You probably don't remember saying that either. But
it sounds like something I think. but I'm so glad I gave you these little snippets.
These nuggets of wisdom. Yeah.
Wow. So I want you guys to be thinking about questions for Elizabeth. So let's see. This is a student question because some students have difficulty accessing emotional depth. It might be that they don't trust their experiences enough, trust them to be worthy of the pen. What would you say? What nugget of wisdom would you give to students? Because I do think that they often hide behind genre, or they're afraid to go toward themselves, or they just don't think that the experience they've had is valuable.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to my head is kind of trite, and maybe even like the expression itself is a little problematic, but lean in, right? Lean into your emotions, lean into your experience. Your experiences have value. And what I love about poetry is that I don't feel like I have to construct anything first. I can let everything that I'm feeling onto the page and then go back and construct it. Give yourself that freedom. What freedom is that, right? To be able to put everything that you're feeling, the pain that you have, the feeling of joy or beauty that you have onto the page, and then put it aside for a little bit and go back to it and see what it'll become. And you do have something of value to say. We all do. And, I tell my students this too. There is certainly rejection involved if you want to be a writer, right? I was just telling my students that if you go to my submittable page, right, when you submit your work, you get like a little green, mark if it's been accepted, and then you get like gray. I guess they don't want to do red if it's not. And I have green, and then I have pages and pages of gray, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that your work is not valuable, or that it won't land somewhere, or that it's not worthy to not only have written, but to put out there. And your work is worth putting out there. So that's what I'd say.
Well, that's excellent. I was telling a student the other day that it is all about rejection. Mm-hmm. It's mainly about rejection, the life of a writer. And you have to have a thick skin to be able to endure that. And it doesn't mean anything. I'm still really fascinated with the poetry because poetry actually terrifies me, and my husband is a poet, but I just don't feel that I could write a poem. But listening to you talk about writing poetry and how it helped it's a challenge in a way. It's inspiring. But were there any hurdles toward taking on that form? Were you intimidated at all, or you just dove right in?
I think it's interesting because I think I was always intimidated by poetry. Poetry was always something I kind of like wrote in the back and kept away. And, and I wasn't, I didn't take myself seriously as a poet. And then I think it was that kind of burst of emotion and anger. And, I was also angry and, or perhaps that's not the right word, but incensed and heartbroken that it was hard, even though I found a lot of, and since then I've found great writers who write particularly about baby loss. But it was hard for me at first to find people who wanted to talk about it, or books that were specifically about that in literature, right? And so I think that was also an impetus, that I really wanted this particular experience to be helpful potentially. And so I guess I in that way I had like a little of a fire that I didn't have before. And so even though I was nervous and of course always self-doubting, I mean, what writer doesn't self-doubt, right? Or anyone, we all do.
Part of the job description.
Yes, it is. I just kind of decided that's it. I had nothing else to lose. I wanted to write. I wrote it, and I wanted to get it out there, and I did it. And I am so glad I did. Yeah.
So students I know they're always very interested in how did you get from here to there? Mm-hmm. So how did you get from being at Hofstra?
About a school bus, and it ended up being about the horrific shooting in Uvalde, and I didn't know that that's where I was going when I started writing it. And so you might surprise yourself as you're writing by building. That's what poetry allows us to do, making those connections. That leads to that depth, I think.
I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
This is Dina.
Hi.
Dina.
I have a question also about the poetry. I'm kind of like Martha, where poetry terrifies me. The thought of, I love reading it, but the thought of writing it. And I love how you spoke about the depth of your emotion and the visceral reaction you were having to what was happening to you, and the form of poetry called you to, as a way to express those feelings. And then you said you put the poems away. Mm-hmm. Now I'm wondering, when you went back to them, because how did you just understand the form, like poetry as a form? The rhythm of it. I mean, I think that's what I find so scary about it. How did you go about crafting the poems as they are now in the book?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'm scared of forms in poetry too, right? I teach them in my poetry classes, but I am not a good sonnet writer, for example, or I teach villanelles, and I like my free verse, but I think the integral part of revising poetry for me is reading it aloud and hearing how it sounds, and deleting and adding based on the syllables, that you're hearing, the pattern. For me, a lot of times it involves a lot of cutting. This is something I learned, I think, from your class too. A lot of times I wrote short stories, and I would end up cutting the first paragraph or two because I was winding my way up to getting to something, right? I think a lot of writers do that. And so with poetry, a similar thing. I could have long poems that a lot of it didn't work, and I'd cut that out, and I could hear it when I was reading it aloud that it didn't quite work, and again, it's hard to do, to cut that, because it's hard to kill your darlings, to let some of these things go. But it was really in the distance, reading it aloud, that I think those are the most useful tools to me in revising poetry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So to take us away from the creative process, kind of, unfortunately,
This is Matt.
Hi, Matt.
I had a question about kind of the world of, or I just kind of want to get a sense of the world of, like, I don't know what other word to use aside from professional, but this kind of world of creative essay writing in the realm of these, in the realm of creative writing, or just, the writing scene overall. I've never really, it's never really occurred to me that, writing an essay type, pieces of writing could be a part of that instead of, say, a more traditional story or a poem. So how does that kind of world work?
That's a good question. I love these questions of genre, right? The essay, is such an interesting and creative nonfiction is such an interesting genre. I think I fell in love with essays through James Baldwin. If you've ever read James Baldwin's essays, one of the things that he does and that I really appreciate about essay writing as a genre is that you can kind of pan out, and this is what he did so well, right? Pan out and then pan back in and draw these connections between the larger world and then your experience that illustrates them. I don't necessarily do that in Cottage by the Beach, but I've written other essays that do that, and I think that that's what the strength of essay writing is. Also, there's this, if anyone is interested in this, and I'm going to forget his name, but there's this wonderful book of letters and essays and poems written, it's called Letters from Max, between the playwright Sarah Rule and Max. I forget his last name. He was a young poet who died of cancer, tragically, very young. And I think they broach these topics a lot, and you can see essay / letter form in conjunction with poetry, and the way they do different things, but they can meld together in this book, Yeah.
All right, well, thank you. I'll keep those in mind to look at.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Anybody? If not, I have one from a student who wanted to be here but can't. She said, she has two. She says, was it easier or harder to write with more distance from the event? And how did you choose which details to include?
Ooh, yeah. Those are hard questions. I think both in terms of distance. Easier in some ways. I think it was easier for me to revise after the fact the poems, but it's not easier for me to write in the distance, because there's something about writing in that fit of passion for poetry, right? And it's almost like when you write poetry, it's almost like you're in this magic, like furious trance of writing it, right? And you can, because it's in short bursts of writing, right? And so it's so emotionally charged and driven. And so I think that in some way my grief at that moment was like my superpower, whereas the distance was certainly required for the revision. So I think there are benefits to both, and added difficulties with both. And then the second question was about the details.
Yeah, how do you choose details?
Oh, That's a really good question. Well, what I tell my students is sensory details are so incredible, right? It's so important to bring into poetry. You know,
I think my students have heard a bit of that.
Yeah. So you guys know all about sensory details, and I was listening to a radio show about one of the worst years on record. It was Radiolab, which is a really great radio show, and I think 546 there was AD. There was volcanoes and like volcanic ash that was falling, and it was cold, and the sun wasn't shining for the better part of a year, and crops were failing. And the radio host asks, "I wonder what it sounded like," right? And I think that that's a good starting off point for poets. You know, what does it sound like? What does it feel like? You know, how describe what it feels like to be human in this moment, to look at something for the first time. How would you describe it to someone? And then from there, you imbue it with meaning. So it can be you use that sensory detail, that figurative language to describe something. And I find that as you do that, like I said, it transforms, and you can make it into something else by the end of the poem, something that has a larger meaning than just describing the sound of an awful year or the beautiful petals on a particular flower or something, right? So,
fabulous answers. So there are books for sale back there, and please buy them. And Elizabeth will sign them. And help me thank Elizabeth for this wonderful reading and conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
So I said, "Oh, I wonder, do you know who they're from?"
Do you know I think she was a little...
To, publishing a book of poetry, writing essays, having I know you have a PhD, but what did that look like? And what kind of courage did it take?
A lot of flying by the seat of my pants, more so than courage. So I went, my senior year at Hofstra, I studied abroad in Paris. And that was also life-changing to me. I met my husband there, my French husband back there. And we spent a few years there, came back, and I did my MFA at the New School, not in poetry, in fiction writing. Then, kind of graduated, had student loans, was very nervous about making money after an MFA, went into teaching, went for my PhD in comparative literature. And then while I was doing my PhD, as a way, when I had my first son, as a way to kind of make ends meet, I started taking freelance writing jobs, which led to publishing educational books. I've written about 20 education books for middle school age, high schoolers. And that got writing, even though it's a very different kind of writing, it got writing back into my life in a way, and I was able to carve out that time. So writing has always been part of my life in very different kind of manifestations, and I was kind of able to, out of pure desperation, parlay it into something in various ways at various parts of my life. So it was a circuitous path, but I think made me who I am today. So,
right, and it's the path of always having to navigate the money issue. And
yeah.
I like
hard.
there are many different ways, and you took on writing What kind of books were they? They were like readers for educational readers?
Yeah, educational readers. Yeah. Like nonfiction books for Rosen Publishing and publishing houses like that I think have really took a hit in recent years. But yeah, I think that also gave me a courage, right? Even though it's a very different kind of writing, to say, maybe I can call myself a writer, Like I'm writing this book and they're giving me not much payment for it, but something. And maybe I can start to like inhabit and say, yes, I am a writer. I never wanted to say that before because it felt like, no, I'm not really. I've never published anything. And so it does require like a leap of faith, right? Writing and it requires a leap of faith and courage. It does.
So you wrote this beautiful essay, A Cottage by the Beach, and it's similar material. What would you say, when did you write that in relationship to when you were writing the poetry? And how does the form differ? Like, how does that, what's the...
That's another good question. So I wrote that after the poetry, and I think the difference was that it kind of hatched less from raw emotion and more from an idea of telling a story of grief around not just the person that I lost, but around this structure, around a house and the story of a house and the story of a house that saved me. So I think it required less, it required more structure and thought of structure and planning and more harnessing, I think, of my emotions in a way that I didn't quite do, at least with the first drafts of the poems. And so it required, I think that required the distance that I had, by the time I was able to write that.
How much time had passed?
5 years.
Oh, okay. So you had
I had a good.
What I'm getting at too is the distance that you sometimes need in writing to be able to able to, I don't know, to be able to see it, to be able to understand how you can make the metaphors of the house protecting and the other the other information is not too close, and so you have more perspective on it. Yeah.
I think it does require distance, and also, like I was saying before, and this is probably something I learned from you and Philip Lopate.
Oh yeah.
But that you always put, you put your first draft aside. And you get the distance from your first draft too. Yeah. So not just from the moment that you might be reflecting back on, but it's also important to have that distance as you're revising and as you're drafting, and not to love your darlings too much. That's Hemingway, but I think...
is it Hemingway or Faulkner?
Oh, or maybe it's Faulkner.
I don't know.
Maybe it's Faulkner. But I
kill
think
your little darlings.
Yeah, kill your little darlings. But I think also Professor Lopate would say that to us too. Don't like your main characters too much.
So I'd like to open it up to some questions from you guys. So there's a microphone right there. I invite you. This is Ronnie.
Hi.
Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to share with us, and such emotionally charged pieces, and kind of to what Professor McPhee had hinted at, questioning if there was solace in writing them. I wanted to know, is there also a sense of, I don't want to say relief, but to borrow a term, solace in publishing the piece, to understand that not only your story but your son's is now fully realized and materialized, to kind of display to others that although the experience with grief might be unique, the experience of grief is universal, and therefore there can be some taken from it.
Well, thanks so much for that question, Ronnie, because it's so astute, and you express that so beautifully. And I think that you're exactly right. I think that there is solace in when you lose a baby. One of the hardest things, as I said, is grappling with a world that didn't know your child, right? And to be able to write about him and to put his life, brief as it was, and his name out there is more meaningful than anything in the world to me. And so that's also why I appreciate, being able to talk about my poetry and to be able to come and to talk to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to respond to something, I forget which one of you said it, but about the creative process, the fact that you get rejected more than you get accepted. It brings to mind, I'm personally surprised, this is the first time I'm realizing it, but it brings to mind something that I feel when I'm reading something or watching something, that when you're a reader, you skim past a million different things. Like you're rejecting other reader, whatever I'm saying, other writers' material all the time. Like you read way less than you don't read. So I feel like there is definitely, if you're a writer and you're just constantly putting out stuff, it's like, why aren't people interested when you yourself aren't necessarily interested in what everyone else is doing all of the time? So I feel like that's just something that we can all just keep in mind, that it's on us to, like, if somebody rejects something you do, that's a reflection of what they want to see, not a reflection of what you're doing.
Yeah. I think that's a good reminder. And also, when you were speaking, I was thinking that, like, different books call to us at different times in our lives, right? So you might pass by one book or one author at one time in your life, or you might read it and not appreciate it, right? And then at a different moment in your life, it could have immense meaning to you, and and that's what's so amazing about books. There's worlds contained within, and they call to you when you need them, right? When they can provide maybe solace, right? Maybe a sense of connection.
That's a lovely way of putting it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Go for it, Cameron.
Hi, so this is just a general, I guess you could say life question in your career. I recall you saying that you got your MFA in fiction writing. So I just wanted to ask, how did getting your master's in fiction writing benefit you in your writing? And would you recommend, after graduation, for students who want to pursue in writing, whether it be a novelist or anything else, would you recommend getting a higher education within writing, or is it more of a skill you develop and it's not necessary?
That's a great question. How to answer that question? I think that I got a lot from my MFA program. I think I did. I think one of the reasons I got a lot is because I was at the New School, and so I felt like I was part of this, pulsing of artistic creation, and I got to see amazing writers and be in book clubs and book groups, and my world for those 2 years was kind of subsumed by literature and writing and thinking about it, and the people who love that as well. And so it was an incredibly wonderful experience. I would suggest applying. I applied and I got into the program even though I didn't get a scholarship. And so I think that there's also financial consideration for that too. There are really great MFA programs that offer scholarships. And I would say keep applying and go for one of those. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't go into debt for it.
Don't go into debt for it. Yeah, because there's also other ways that you can build that writing community as well, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Donovan.
Hi.
Hi. You mentioned earlier about being able to kind of reach deeper, lean in a bit more emotionally, and also that young writers struggle. I think with me, I sometimes also have a struggle for different reasons. When I write, I usually write kind of to test myself, to experiment, to adapt, to learn more. But I do sometimes feel, I also just don't find my own life that interesting, no matter how many colorful descriptions I put on it. So I guess my thing would be, how would, for newer writers, I guess, how would you want to cultivate that emotional core? Like any advice to cultivate that emotional core, if possible?
To cultivate the emotional kind of like the depth that you're saying in the writing? Yeah. I think it's there, right? I think it's there, and it's just a question of giving yourself the permission to access it, or finding the access point to it. And I think that's a scary thing to do. I think that's what we were talking about. It's incredibly vulnerable and scary to put those emotions on the page. And so sometimes it's really easy, I might have said this before, but when I wrote these poems, I wasn't thinking of publishing them. They were just for me. And I'm kind of glad that I did that, because I think me the permission to write what I really wanted to say. And so give yourself that permission. You have the emotional depth, to write about, the things that really strike you. And you'll find those things, and then just keep on doing it, right? Keep on doing it, and you can write poems about anything, and you'd be surprised. The other thing that I love about poetry is that you could write about one thing, right? It might be like an observation of a pretty flower, and then it becomes something totally different. I wrote a poem.